So I'm thinking there straight away from that video that we've just watching, how interesting it is to think about this idea of what is feedback. Thinking very carefully about the processes and the different levels of feedback that we receive. And it was interesting the terms feed up, feedback, and feed on or feed forward were used. These are much the same or mean similar things to our Map Master Move On program that we have in place for this year. Ask yourself, how often are you using task level or product feedback as a member of staff? Is it always about that task level or product feedback? Or perhaps it's about using an awful lot of personal level feedback. Both of those two methods are proved and shown to be less effective than process level feedback. It's great to give specific feedback on a question, but the child will only develop their answer for that particular question. Realistically, when we start to think about this idea of feedback, we must link in the memory systems and this idea of information processing. Now, Baddeley and Hitch in 1974 talked about this idea of working memory. And working memory works within the short-term memory store or memory system. And the short-term memory store is a process that deals with three different slaves under what we call the central executive. The central executive will decide what information is encoded and goes into long-term memory and what information to retrieve from long-term memory in order to actually create an output for the person who's working. Now, there's three different slaves that are talked about by Baddeley and Hitch in this particular model. Those three different slaves are the phonological loop, which is how we deal with auditory information. The visuospatial sketchpad, what a name, the visuospatial sketchpad that deals with images. We know that images for youngsters, images for all learners are far easier to chunk together. Think about people who have these amazing memory skills that can quote pi to 1,000 decimal places. And these are the people who will quite often encode their memory by thinking about a picture, thinking about a journey that they take. In the same way that we have to think about the information that we give to our youngsters, particularly within our feedback, being chunked, being put together in some way. And then for me, the most important part of this is the episodic buffer. The episodic buffer often deals with sequencing, how we put things together. And I think the episodic buffer, when I think about Baddeley and Hitch's model, links most closely with process level feedback. What are the steps that I need to go through in order to get to the final answer? Now, for the working memory to be most effective, there are several processes that we have to consider as teachers and several processes that we need to think about in feedback. If we want to be teachers who are going to respond to the feedback, change our teaching styles. Now, the processes that are particularly effective in this working memory model are the process of modelling by this member of staff. We don't have to give 30 different pieces of feedback. In fact, they're often not 30 different pieces of feedback because we're repeating the same thing. We don't need to keep writing those down on 30 different exercise books. How can we chunk them together? How can we give the whole picture back to the people that we're working with? The second process is this idea of vicarious experience. This is particularly important in the phonological loop. If we are going to enable our youngsters to make the most of the feedback that we give them, they need to be able to respect us. And that respect often comes from a relationship a working relationship. Too often as teachers, we can be that strict person who stands at the front of the class and just tells people off all lesson long. Copy this, write down this. We have to be far more open now to standing at the front of the room and reflecting and mirroring what we're seeing of the youngsters and the learners in front of us. Paying attention to what's going on there in the corner of the room, what's going on at the front of the room, where is it, what's happening here at the side. We're in a system now where we can't break that line. It is tough. It's really, really difficult. I'm not sure I have all of the answers to any of this, but we have to think about this relationship model, and we have to think about vicarious experience being most powerful when the youngsters respect us, when they understand the processes that are taking place, when they recognize that we're mapping, we're modeling, we're allowing them to master the information and move on. Now that's about memory, and that's about putting things forwards. EEF guidance says to us, when we think about feedback, it needs to be specific, accurate, and clear. Give it sparingly so that it has more meaning behind it. The more feedback we give to someone, the more white noise they hear. The other thing that the EEF says when they discuss this idea of feedback is that it should be about complex or challenging tasks. We don't have to give feedback on every piece of work that we see. What was very interesting during full lockdown were the members of staff that came back on the staff surveys and said, I'm not going to lower my standards. It was interesting how giving whole class feedback was seen as a lowering of standards. It was very interesting to see members of staff who were spending inordinate amounts of time on Google Classroom marking every piece of work that came in. And we've got to be a little bit smarter in the way that we work. Which tasks need feedback? Which tasks need general feedback? Which tasks need an individual tutorial or a conversation? And how do we achieve that under the current framework in which we're working? Remember that feedback doesn't just have to come from us as members of staff. Feedback can come from the peers as long as we give them frameworks within which to work. A student working with another student isn't necessarily going to know all of the answers. So we have to consider that when we're thinking about guidance. Two other articles, 5 Tenets of Good Learning by Mark Enser over at Heathfield Community College, and Alex Rich, How to Give Good Feedback from a Distance, state these things. When we're giving feedback, put down the red pen. Mark Enser from Heathfield Community College is a huge advocate of the verbal feedback project. We're now in this situation where we shouldn't be taking in work on a regular basis. We've really got to find ways of reducing that. It's all very well saying it's going to sit in quarantine for 72 hours before I pick it up, but we're not modelling best practice if we keep taking that work in and we keep pushing it out. We've got to be really, really aware of what's going on in and around us. So realistically, how can we mark students' work? Is it about better use of technology? Enser also talks about this idea of show and tell. So that's about demonstrations. That's about modelling from the front. The idea about it's good to talk and review it are about one-to-one conversations. And what I would say to you now is, how do we achieve those in the classroom? Realistically, do I want a one-to-one feedback to be heard by everybody? Do I need to use Mr. Jackson and Miss Hyland's wave model of movement of youngsters around the classroom each lesson in order to allow those conversations to take place? Or do we need to investigate a table at the front, a feedback table? or a perspex frame in the classroom that allows the teacher to have those one-to-one conversations. And the other thing is about being a responsive teacher. How do we respond to the feedback that we get? It's not just about what we give out. It's about viewing that whole picture, viewing that display that's in front of us, and recognizing the behaviors that we see. Alex Riches says, when we're looking at how to give feedback from a distance, types of things that we need to look at are interactions, whole class feedback methods. And you might think this is a bit odd, but this idea of quizzes and low stakes testing. Stella did a great presentation and a great piece of CPD to sixth form teachers, but I don't think it's just relevant to sixth form teachers. The idea of signposting very clearly where youngsters are with their assessment outcomes, and the idea of having an entrance ticket and an exit ticket, not just a plenary where we're telling somebody something, not just an introductory task where we're throwing out that hook that's really going to make our learners think about what's going on, but this idea about test on what's been learnt previously. Interleave those tests. It's not just about what was learnt last lesson, but it's what was learnt last year. And also, coming back, the same as INSET, modelled responses. Note that they came in both these different presentations. The next thing that I'd like you to do is watch the video below on effective feedback.